Hey there, everybody. I'm Brian from Fools and Sages. Welcome, new folks, and welcome back to longtime viewers. This is our 81st long form episode. And this is a kind of an interesting one because it's sort of a self reflective episode in that we're trying to communicate and also sort of open up what exactly we're trying to do with the podcast and specifically to do with the ideas behind dialogue. So, as always, this is unscripted. There's no AI content. We don't know where we're going to end up or what's going to happen. We sort of are working on the fly. You'll notice we're sort of working our way through some thoughts. And this episode this week starts with a question about organizations as living systems. And so we start looking at living systems through the light of maybe some of the ways we typically think about them, and therefore some of the mistakes we might make when we think about organizations of humans in particular. And when we break it down, what are organizations of humans? It has to do with meaningful interactions. And in the idea of meaningful, it means where there is some meaning that's being passed back and forth. And that implies a type of communication. And that's the crux that we try to focus on. And now, when I went to school years ago, you can see years ago, to study philosophy, we talked a lot about dialogue and dialectic because it's an idea that goes back literally before the year zero. And the ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, his teacher, explored the idea of dialectic, question and answer, back and forth between two people, juxtaposed to the idea of rhetoric. Rhetoric being one person making a pitch, making an argument. Might be a politician, an orator, might be a religious leader, it might be an attorney making a plea for a client to a jury or a judge, might be someone trying to sell you their soap. But the rhetoric we are surrounded with constantly. So we start to take a look at how does this happen? And when I was a student, Socrates had dialogue and we'd read those and you'd see how through this question and answer, a reason process went on. And the idea was that we got the truth through that somehow. Well, fast forward through the story of philosophy, a lot of which we try to reprise in its more practical aspects through the previous 80 episodes and the future episodes we'll have here. We get to some of the more modern philosophers that actually, died in the 1900s. For those youngsters that are listening, I am also from the 1900s. And for them, discourse became very, very significant. There was a philosopher that we talked about in our last episode by the name, or the episode before, it'll be a few episodes back. His name was Heidegger, a German. And Heidegger had two students, one whose name was Gadamer and one whose name was Levinas. That's Hans-Georg Gadamer and Immanuel Levinas. And for both of these philosophers, they took the work of their teacher and they sort of pushed it further in different directions. But for both of them, for slightly differing reasons and in different contexts, dialogue and dialectic became very important. And it became more than just questions and answers to find truth. It became part of a bigger philosophical structure that they used to sort of understand humans and the whole big picture. So, for example, for Gadamer, he had this idea of that we had horizons of understanding, and that through discourse, our the horizon represented sort of from our viewpoint everything that we could understand about our life and the world and everything, as we say. And that horizon, like our visual horizon, it goes off to things that we see less clearly and less clearly till finally it's just sort of a blur on the horizon. So for Gadamer, uh, conversation or discourse was an opportunity for there to be the fusion of horizons. And so, for Gadamer, there was this idea that conversation used language in a way that was fundamental to our understanding. And then for Emmanuel Levinas, who was another student of Heidegger, he saw discourse in an almost mystical way as an encounter with what he called the other, as a way of seeing and encountering the face of the other. And the face of the other speaks. And the thing about the other, which is where this gets almost mystical, is that what other people represent for Levinas is a kind of an infinity. We will never be able to completely map out, to completely understand where that person is and what it is to be that person and how their world of meaning is constellated. So the most that we can do is sort of reach, if our communication is correct and if we're in the right place, if we're not doing injustice to the other by trying to cram it into our own worldview. What does that look like? Looks like rhetoric. Looks like saying, this is what I want you to think because this is my picture of the world and I want you to take my picture of the world, and here it is. So Levinas calls that totalizing, an effort to totalize the other. But the other is infinite. We'll never be able to put it into our finite models. So it will resist that. So we have to actually go through a different process, which is interesting. His teacher, Heidegger, had this idea of gelassen, releasement, or allowing being to be. And this is almost like that, the idea that we have to allow the other to be, and that in our interaction with that other, we actually interact with this infinity. We allow space for this infinity, and that's where we have an interaction that you might almost say, he might actually go so far as to say that's where we will find God. That our interaction with that other actually puts a moral obligation upon us. Again, very much related to Heidegger and this idea that our very identity is to be in the world and to be connected to others. So we discuss that and we talk about it in the organizations and we follow it from place to place and we try to understand how some of these things work and the different ways people think about it. And, so it's stuff that you can try on too. So I don't want to go on too long here, but welcome to this episode, which is Gadamer, Levinas, and a magical kind of ping pong. Enjoy.
Howdy, Brian.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. How are you?
Doing good. Keeping warm. Got my
Keeping
fire
warm.
going.
Good.
Yep.
I've been thinking lately about how it's pretty common to hear somebody say something like organizations are living systems, and you can't, in a living system, you can't just pull a lever and expect a certain outcome to happen. That human systems, like all living systems, have a, a degree of complexity that makes them inherently unpredictable. And the example that I always hear about this is in Yellowstone, when they reintroduced the wolves, it actually resulted in rivers changing course.
Yep.
Because the wolves caused the deer patterns to change, and the deer patterns caused the grazing areas to change, and trees grew in different places, and etc.
Yeah, I think it was elk herds actually that were
Oh,
grazing the
yeah.
riparian areas. Yeah.
So and it didn't even take long. I think it was like 20 years, and like the river had moved considerably.
Yep.
So we were talking a little bit offline about pragmatism, and there's a connection between kind of going with the system that works instead of looking for a system that is right or correct. And this idea of living systems, because I think there might be that when we talk about pulling a lever and expecting a specific outcome, we're talking about the hubris of thinking that there's a binary or even complicated but not complex answer to a question in a complex system. And I mean, maybe there are some cases of that, but my point is that's often not the case.
Yep.
And
Yep.
um and I sort of bristle a little bit when I hear that, oh, maybe we should let go of looking for absolute truth because I'm just a child of an idealist. I don't mean I am this. I don't mean my parents are idealists. I mean I'm a child in my idealism, because I want to believe that there's like an ultimate understanding of how things work that won't be attainable for me, but exists, and I can, keep getting closer to it. And letting go of that is kind of painful. It's like letting go of a dream understanding of reality. So I just thought I'd toss that out there and see what comes back.
Yeah. Well, first thought, organizations as living systems, um, like living systems, they live within an environment. So they have that whole on thing. They've got to connect to the outside and they've got to have agency as an entity. And so that's often where a lot of the challenges come in, right? Because for example, what the C-suite people are usually paying attention to is how does this unit plug into the larger environment in a way that it thrives? And then you have management kind of focused on let's not kill each other in the process. And if we're lucky, we'll optimize at least some people's performance, right? I mean, that's what the Pareto distribution or Price's law is. It says that at least we'll get the best performance out of the square root of the total number of people that we're working with, and then hopefully, we can maintain something that encourages the best and the brightest to stay, and but I don't think there is a way to predict it because I believe in free will. Whether I do it pragmatically or absolutely remains to be seen. Uh,
We'll have to come back to that. Yeah.
yeah, but that is that distinction. And um, so, so what I see, we've talked before about each individual human being an infinity. And this is kind of the way it dovetails in with a little conversation we had about upcoming conversations I'm preparing mentally for, just to make sure I understand all the threads about William James, who's a luminary. We've indicated him a little bit, but we've really not opened that coconut shell yet, and we shall. I vow we shall. But his idea is, what our previous episode was about the tracking frogs in the maelstrom, with this idea that we are all in a cognitive maelstrom, and within that there are many, many elements, and they are within a flow. James was one of the first ones to come up with the idea of a stream of consciousness, for example. So they're within this flow. He reckoned it, he associated with like the pecking of a bird. It's kind of flits, and that's the way our attention typically works. And so this idea that we're steady state creatures is kind of a fallacy. That's that impulse to thingify something that's actually alive and dynamic and flowing. And so we've sort of talked about that our consciousness is flowing within this maelstrom of many, many different cognitive elements, but we notice certain things. And maybe we notice a million things out of the billion things that fly by, or the trillion data points that fly by, and we're sorting, we're parsing, we're choosing. And the point is that what I choose and what you choose will never be identical and put anybody in that seat. We're all choosing based on a unique identity, and that's where to look for free will. And there's no predicting it because it comes out of a cyclone. When you can predict a cyclone and where every frog and cow and mailbox and everything flies, then come and talk to me about determinism. But until then, I maintain that the cyclone is as good as any roulette wheel, and that what we pick out of it is our unique thumbprint. And that's an expression of our free will, as an expression of our identity. And so now we've got all those million data points that we uniquely pull out for our interpretation. And it's out of that we get meaning. And now go ahead.
So that's a little different than, or the how you just described free will, I think would be countered by um, uh, detractors from the idea with, just because you have an identity and you choose different things out of the maelstrom, um, so your cognitive model is different, your narrative is different. You're a snowflake. It's great, but that isn't a basis for free will. Do you want to respond to, like, can you
Well,
elaborate on why
I
you think
think that
free will lives
I think
there?
that that's one of the things I want to let William James elaborate on, because the topic of free will is so central, not just to his work, but to the experience of his life, which motivated all of his work. And
Well, and
when
it turns out to be central to any of our big questions, right? I
it
mean,
seems, it seems
how we relate to the idea of meaning is I think wildly different if
right.
free will exists or not.
And I think I've said before with when we were talking about the slippery fish of the self, that before we can really talk about free will, there's a presupposition of what wills, and until we unfold that self, we really can't predicate things off of it without understanding its nature. And that's where Heidegger stands, and that's why he goes into all this detail, this grueling detail about trying to unfold the uniqueness of being a human being, or what he calls Dasein, which we've touched on before.
Not
But
just a human
so
being, but an individual, right?
individual human beings in a here and now. And that's why it's not Sein, Sein, which in German is being, but it's Dasein. Da is like there. And so it's like we've referred to the foot nailed down. That's kind of literally the there that he's pointing about, is it's nailed down somewhere. And that's the Da of the Dasein. So, so but my point is, that we got through Heidegger to Gadamer, who said that, every person is an infinity. I think Levinas, supported that idea. Every person is an infinity. And so through building this bridge of language, or through shared meaning, which is what we refer to as a fusion of horizons, people's cognitive models can sort of sync. And in that syncing, both cognitive models are expanded. So it's as if we get, maybe we didn't go to Paris, but we, talked for a few hours with a friend who spent a bunch of time there. Now we've got a much better idea about it. Our cognitive model has a lot of Paris things sketched in that it didn't before, because we shared that horizon, a little bit. And there's a lot of a technical meaning of what this horizon of understanding is and all. But the point is that so you've got each individual as an infinity. And now an organization, if a Martian looks at it, all they see is a bunch of humans that are interacting and communicating. And so certain things are presupposed in that there's a shared world of meaning, that there's a good overlap. And that collective overlap we could start to think of as the egregore of the enterprise. And we can see these things evolve over time, a la the nature of chapters in a life cycle. And, but I think the fiber of it, the fabric of it, the weave of it is this web of linguistic interaction, the collective linguisticality of the undertaking. And within that, you'll find values. Within that, you'll find the dynamics of interaction. Within that, you'll find something that distills into the face of that organization out in the environment. And I think that's the sort of thing that it's a very complicated network. And that's probably very cultural. I know that it works different ways within certain different cultures. And I presume that this is dovetails with shared cultural worldviews. How you go about things, the culture of a Chinese corporation or a Japanese corporation or an American or a German or a, they all dovetail into this gestalt that plugs into a worldview. So that's part of the ocean that this vessel of an organization has to move in, the currents, if you will.
There's just one of many factors that can't be flattened out.
Yep,
You
yep.
mentioned communication.
Too many infinities bouncing into each other,
Yeah.
to call
You
it. Yeah.
you mentioned communication. And I was reading something about ants recently, and when you said, imagine an alien watching like what's happening in an organization, it's similar to us watching ants, and it's kind of astounding what they're capable of with very few communication options. Like I think they have something like they have like a few different pheromones, and then they have the instinct that moving towards higher concentration of a pheromone means they should do more of whatever that pheromone signals. And that's
Right.
kind of it. And then they build cities and, bury their dead and, clean up on the weekends. And I mean, they have like relatively complex civilizations considering their frontal lobe size. Um,
Well, see, and that's part of that mystery of how consciousness interacts with matter. And, according to the most popular philosophical definitions, ants would have to have some kind of consciousness. They roughly say you have consciousness if there is something that it is like to be you. And one has to presume that there is something that it's like to be an ant because it is responding to those pheromones, and it does have these behaviors that, as behavioristic as you might want to get, or as biochemical as you might want to get, there's still something that it is like to be an ant. And this really dovetails into the big we, because there is no ant without the big we. Like it's definitely tweaked in the collective direction from the independent collection. The independents,
ants, ants
they're
are
totally
very familiar.
disposable.
Ants are very familiar with replacing the coldness of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism.
Yeah, yeah, dying for the herd. Hey, you're gonna make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And there is some psychology. There are certain psychologists that would argue that that is within the cultural programming of males, is to actually sacrifice themselves, plugging into that biological phenomenon that one male can suffice to for a generation, whereas one female can't. So that makes males pretty disposable. And so there's a school of thought that says that males are actually predetermined to have that self-sacrificing impulse. Uh, and I'm not going to say one way or the other, but I say it's worthy taking that on as an idea for introspection to see if one feels, inordinately compelled to fall on their own sword or something like that.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
I want to go back to the beginning because I think there was a little more to mind there. Because you said the first thing that comes to mind is when we talk about organizations, here's what we're talking about. But I'm seeing this connection that I think you probably have more to say about between a cognitive model that's good enough instead of trying to um, find the truth with a capital T, but rather growing corn is sufficient. And what really rankled me was I think before we started recording, you said it doesn't matter so much if there is a God, but if believing that there is one makes your life better, then that's what you should do. And that that's going to take me a while to get comfortable with. But there's a connection, I think, between that and this idea of living systems and dealing with complexity. And especially that the cognitive model needs to be malleable and adaptable, and what grows corn can change from minute to minute and on different scales from year to year. And it's not one cognitive model that does it, but rather the merging of horizons that can provide a right, the merging of horizons and communication that can provide a system that grows corn in a complex environment. And I just want to share like a quick anecdote. Sometimes leveling up the system can come in surprising ways. Like I did a dialogue session recently where before the dialogue started, every participant who had thought about this question in advance kind of seeded the dialogue with a description of a narrative that's active in their life and a question that they're asking themselves as a result. And so it just called for a level of introspection that we don't necessarily all carry with us moment to moment, even if we're capable of it and we do it on, you know, um, when we get up in the morning and meditate or whatever, we're not always holding that. And so it made the dialogue deeper. Everybody had like kind of a deeper experience, and that expanded the cognitive model for that group, at least temporarily, to experience reality and the complexity of reality in a more nuanced and more fulsome way. And then, but that doesn't mean that's what's going to work again,
Right.
right? Even though maybe the idea of bringing more self-awareness into our collective practice and doing that intentionally, that might be a replicable model.
Yeah. Well, and I think that again, this becomes, maybe as individual as a fingerprint. Every organization might have its own organizational Overton window. And we may be carrying in some presumptions when we call these things organizations.
Say
Maybe
more.
maybe cyclotrons is more accurate, where
Oh, with a
every participant
TSY.
with a psyche in there, yeah,
Yeah,
psychelotron, yeah, where
cyclotrons.
you've got a circulation, a whirling of minds. Right? I mean, because if you think about this just from that idea, if consciousness is really like pecking around like birds, flitting from one thing to another, and now we create a container where those bounce off of each other, both in organized and in random ways, right? Because you have your board meetings and then you also have your water cooler meetings. And so you've got all of these infinities bouncing off of each other in unpredictable ways, somewhat directed and regulated by the collective Overton window. That is, here we are, we're in this setting, we're at work, we're at,
A series of
you know,
larger and larger collective Overton windows.
right,
Well, your
right. But that
community
within this group,
and
this is the kind of stuff we tend to talk about. And this is the kind of, like if we're a group about playing music, our Overton window might not extend about political conversations. And if two people start having a political conversation, everybody else is there to play music, there might be some feelings about it. Right. So the group has its window before anybody says anything. And so a practice like you're talking about that sort of redefines the window can or cannot work depending on the mix. The people that are doing it, the people you're making it up, the facilitators have a huge amount of, you know, and, in some respect, this is kind of what goes on when you do counseling with somebody. You bring a certain languaging, a certain microscope that you drop down onto things. And within that world of meaning, it implies certain relationships because that's a big part of what we do with these cognitive models is we're tracking all the relationships of all these things and all these narratives and how they interact. And so often, in working with somebody, what you're really doing rather than you're giving them this meaning nugget, they're going to plug this meaning nugget into their world and all of a sudden things are going to light up. It's often the opposite. It's more like you have taken whatever their experience is and you've set it in a totally different landscape. And when it's in a different landscape, it shows up differently, right? That's a Werner Erhard term. Things show up as rather than are. Very phenomenologist sort of a shift, right? He also talks about thrownness, which he's got to have taken from Heidegger or somebody. He took it from somebody that took it from Heidegger, right? He talks about how we're kind of thrown into the world and then nailed down. He doesn't mention nailed down, but it should be thrown and nailed, like dragged and quartered, thrown and nailed.
that'd be a good Fools and Sages T-shirt at some point. Thrown and nailed.
Exactly. But the idea is there's a solution to it. And so, I guess there's a whole topic there about, and I've wanted to sort of explore, and maybe this is where the whole episode, what is this dialogue that we're talking about? And we've had a whole episode kind of about this, though, was within a different setting. But what is this type of dialogue for it to work the way that Gadamer and Levinas and some of these other philosophers say, for it to really fuse our horizons, for it to substantially change our cognitive models? And, Schopenhauer talking about great teachers I've talked about before. We're sleepwalking. We need to be shocked. That's that same idea. Here's something I've got to reintegrate in my cognitive model, and now my whole world's different
I don't know if
because all
anybody has described a process for that better than David Bohm has.
no, I think though that it just needs to be maybe understood a little more, at least within the context of our conversations, and that maybe some of the distinctions haven't been drawn. For example, I'm trying to learn about YouTube channels. And so very, very conventional wisdom is, well, you start with something that's going to hook people's attention in, and then you package it in a way, and then you deliver on that promise that your packaging implied, and then they stay the whole way. Then everybody's happy. You're Mr. Beast. You're going to make $1 million. And I'm sure that that's true within certain
$1 million.
areas of focus. Yeah, exactly. And but to understand what we're doing as distinct from what typically gets seen, uh, for example, one of the things we can't do is we can't do an introduction before we do the episode because with this meeting of two infinities, I don't know what you're going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say. We don't know how the mutual stirring of the cognitive models, what will come up out of that. And that's why we both can learn something new. And that's why something new can come up that we hadn't predicted. And new connections are made to old places. All of that wouldn't happen if we were debating, because I would be wanting to hold one cognitive model and not let it be altered. And you would be having another. And then we'd be going, rock'em sock'em robots until one head goes, you remember that game? And so, but it's like one paradigm wants to dominate because there's an interest in here that, is attributed to me being stuck at my seat at the table, typically. But this idea that usually Plato is attributed to Socrates. And I understand if people are skeptical of that because you read a lot of Plato and it's like Socrates totally set this guy up. Socrates knew where he was going. He had this all figured out. He didn't learn anything from the slave boy when he's, demonstrating that
But he
all
was
learning is.
open. If
That's
they'd gone
the
in
idea.
that direction, he was open
Yeah.
to it.
Good point. Good point. But I understand that skepticalness. But if we're not Socrates, we're even closer to that experience than he might be, because he's got to look long and hard to find somebody maybe to really wise him up to some degree that he's not already wise. But most of us, luckily, we're not suffering from that deficiency. We got plenty of gaps
I
to
mean,
fill
rising up
in.
to you.
Plenty of wisen up. And so that's where the nature of the encounter is got to be of a certain quality to bring new stuff up, to mine new stuff up. Like when we started a couple episodes back, and we talked about the slippery fish of the self. That was not a preconditioned, like that wasn't a rhetorical piece that had ever shown up before. It just happened to fit the moment. And so the voice at the moment finds it to catch with an image a particular insight. And the idea is that what we try to do in our dialogues, which are not typically debates. And see, the other thing we could do is we could do like AI does nowadays and not have a debate, but we could actually just be giving two sides of one rhetorical presentation. So it's like we could just trade off points, making our case, in which case nothing new would have happened at the end that wasn't already present at the beginning. In fact, we would have cooked up everything from the beginning to make sure that your attention didn't lag at the 30-second mark and then again at the 3-minute mark and all that. Well, this is live. And you never know when the football team's going to score a goal. You never know when there's going to be a fumble or when so unfortunately that's very different than things that are engineered to the attention of spectacle that wants something every second. That's new and engaging, which probably comes from a nervous system that's out in the environment that's trying to spot novelty, because any novelty could be a real problem or an opportunity. I don't know. But anyway, just a diversion there. But anyway, so I felt that it maybe is nice to footnote what we're trying to do here and with our guests is to see what new territory comes up, to see what this unique chemistry of these cognitive models distilled from unique experiences, what they might shake out, you know.
I think that's a really important call out, because I think our content is really different from a lot of what's out there. But there's another layer to it that I propose to you, which is that even as we're looking for new territory, and let's maybe characterize that as refining or expanding the cognitive model, we're also talking about doing that pioneering into new territory with better and better technology. And so there's the reason that we use, let's say, arcane words like hermeneutics or um, phenomenology or uh, pragmatism or whatever, is because these are lenses through which, and they inform one another, but lenses through which the exploration of new territory can take place and be integrated with the existing territory or be allowed to disrupt the existing territory, whichever way that goes. So there's like this dual process happening where we're like, what are the ways we could think about this and this?
Right.
And
And
both
part of
of
that
those.
is and dipping into these older traditions that have a lot of stuff to be mined because of based on certain fundamentals of human experience.
Mhm.
And now common culture doesn't tend to direct us towards those. So
When
there's
you
only a
say
few places you're
older,
going to
when you refer to more ancient systems, are you're what comes up for me is like ancient Chinese wisdom on one hand, and then um, shamanic experience on the other. Is that what you're thinking of?
and Parmenides and just these things that have been our common heritage, our global common heritage that have had a lot of layers, a lot of chapters of stories laid on top so that now they're sort of have fallen out of common experience. And because they're out of common experience, it can at times take a special skill set to be able to mine them out and brush them off and polish them up a little bit to be able to read the letters on the coin, or whatever the image. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do is, we talk to people who spend their whole life focused on one or two of these areas. And what we're trying to do is sort of give a broader picture of that, but give little bridges into those areas and some introduction to the ideas that come from those areas. And, maybe some of the big pictures. Uh, but anyway, so I thought that it would be useful for us maybe to point that out, that that's kind of what's going on here. I mean, it's an old phenomenon, right? Plato is back in the 350 BC or somewhere like that. I mean, the idea of dialogue and even Thomas Aquinas is written in the form of a dialogue, even though you get the feeling that he's kind of like, on both sides of the dialogue, that there's sort of, and I think that there's a bigger picture here too that I haven't really illuminated. And that is, one of the reasons that I pound on the H word, the hermeneutic word, is because of the fundamental role that interpretation plays. And Gadamer really hammers that home. And, he focuses on that that it all happens within a historical setting and all that. But just this idea that interpretation is so fundamental and that the process of interpretation, which we have pointed out as the hermeneutic circle or as a feedback loop, if we drill down into that, I think we would find again questioning and answering. That it's through questioning and answering that in the hermeneutic circle are internalized within a person, because I don't just hold a piece up to the picture of the whole, but I ask myself questions. And then from the data that's available between the piece and the whole, I try to answer those questions. And in fact, I want to get the answer to those questions that is the most parsimonious. In other words, I want to include this new piece while changing as few of the already existing and presumably working well parts of the model, so that I want to slip it in there and do least violence to the worldview that I can, which sometimes is quite a challenge, as you know. But but there's this process, and that very fundamental process, whether we're doing it, modeling it with another person, or we've internalized that process, which is one of the arguments I would say maybe can happen out of a St. John's training, a liberal arts training, is that question and answering process gets put in your own head. So you answer and ask your own questions, which is very efficient,
To
almost
a point.
German in its efficiency.
Yeah, well, to a point, because there are questions that it won't occur to you to ask, and so, you won't get
Absolutely right.
disrupted late.
It and and that's also the role of reading and the role of these great authors, is that we are in dialogue, question and answer with those great authors, with those great minds that Schopenhauer says are so rare that we need to go back and get it out of the literature because we're not gonna run into them at the store, and likely, and we might not get it if we do, whereas this way, it's there to be gotten, so to speak.
I I think there's a parallel there, or maybe even it's even an overlap, a sameness between how you're describing the hermeneutic process, especially when you were talking about, like, you find a new piece of insight and you wanna integrate it with your model, um, in a way that, doesn't Jenga comes to mind, right? That doesn't,
Right?
knock down the whole tower. But, at the same time, you have to be holding yourself accountable for only preserving what should still be preserved, even if that means knocking down the whole tower. And that kind of goes back, I think, to my original question about living systems and how do we, um, encounter them in useful ways, knowing that we can't fully comprehend them, at least um,
Ultimate
not in
meaning.
a logical way, not in a rational way. We might be able to comprehend them in other ways of knowing, which, I think our intuition, for example, apprehends complexity in ways that a rational process can't. We have to be careful about that. But, we've
Yep.
talked about that a little bit before.
Yeah. Well, I've made reference before to this Chinese saying that while your eye is on the horizon, you step over the branch at your feet. And I would argue that maybe if we take that metaphor and really make it work, that there are two different brains, one that looks at the branch at your feet and a whole different brain that looks at the horizon. So if I'm trying to find ultimate truths or final directions, I'm going to use the brain that looks at the horizon. And for me, that has been very different than my everyday brain, because of my unique, background and the practices that I've done. And there are different practices, but things that made me feel that, okay, this state of mind is uh, closer to Spinoza's uh, subspecies eternitatis, that is closer to seeing the world without passion, as Lao Tzu would say, to see the secret of life, to see behind, uh, than other ways of seeing. So, so I would say that we have different avenues to apprehend reality, and that the pragmatist argument is about stepping over the branches at our feet, and that we need to go through a much more, and I don't know where James is on this, but he was into, uh, parapsychology and hypnosis. And like, he really wanted to see all the different directions the mind went. He wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience. So he was very aware that there were these other modes. And so the pragmatic philosophy may well be addressed to people that we don't expect necessarily to be having mystical experiences and therefore able to draw ultimate conclusions from them. And so that maybe looking at outcomes, which is really the pragmatist penchant, is maybe that's something that we can share. And so maybe as a philosophy, it becomes an easier form of collective wisdom rather than this wisdom that is subjective, that's based on uh, non-ordinary experience. Is, I guess, the traditional way it's been used recently. But um,
I was kind of jarred by the phrase collective wisdom. I'm wondering if you can say more about that. You
uh,
mean like what's baked into the culture, so it gets transmitted with language and common narratives that are part of the culture and that sort of thing?
yeah, I think for the most part, I mean, if we can share it to some degree, then it's a collective wisdom. Don't go out in the snow without your shoes on. Kitchen table wisdom. Uh, you know, uh, a kind of a wisdom that's directed towards the elements of everyday life. This kind of touches on Heidegger. Heidegger has this idea he calls everydayness, and that the nature of humanity, or of a human being, really reveals itself in its the way in which it's rooted in its everydayness. And what I'm talking about is not the everydayness. What I'm talking about, and this is one of, in James's variety of religious experience, he's got four qualities that are shared by all religious experience. And, one of them is that you can't just make it happen. Like, it happens on its own and you're in a state of passivity. I think that's his fourth quality. The first one is ineffability. You can't catch it. You can't lay it out that way, right? Uh, but its non-repeatability is a certain component also. And so there are certain uniquenesses to these states of mind that maybe in the old days, or maybe through certain initiations or certain medicines, maybe there were consistent ways. I mean, I know that even the things that have happened to me that that translated to, I think, valid insights of more of a metaphysical nature, uh, they were not predictable. They were still one out of many, many different experiences. It's like, um, you can spend years riding through all the different streets of London, and only on one certain occasion do you run into one particular view, you might say. And this might be sort of like that, except in the case of London, you can find your way back. In this case, the inexpressibility of what it looked like to others and your non-ability to find your way back are two of the distinguishing characteristics of this kind of experience.
Yeah.
So I think that when we recognize that that realm exists, maybe we recognize that is appropriate to certain types of reaching for understanding. And this it seems to me like, one of our previous episodes not too long ago was about category confusion, and this seems like another application of sort of a strictness about categories. If you want to know about the source of the secret of life, you have to look at it without desires, to quote Lao Tzu. And if you want to see the 10,000 things, then that's with desire.
And those correlate to the horizon without desire and the stick you're stepping over as with desire.
Exactly, exactly.
And the
And we all might
idealistic
be
view is on the horizon and the pragmatic view is the stick. in front of you.
Yeah, and there's gonna likely to be a lot of similarity in the kinds of sticks that we're all going to have to step over, but there might be quite a bit of difference in the view of the horizon given on where we're standing, if that makes sense. So the common wisdom is the kind of things, here's the kind of sticks you're likely to run into. Here are the kind of snakes that might be hiding under those sticks. Here are the kind, but the horizon, that's more like that yin will idea, maybe. That's more like, or again, Heidegger has this idea that part of what defines human life is he calls it being towards death, saying this idea that our life is a narrative. And that's sort of this idea that it should carry a certain meaning, like a narrative does, but also that it goes somewhere. And ultimately, where it goes, always with my little friend, is to death. And so, what is the way that we remove that sting is through this world of meaning, right? And so yeah, I mean, there's definitely two games going on there. This is like the bottom up, top down question,
Yeah.
also, because we kind of have to live life both ways, I guess, you know.
So I wonder if you want to come back to free will and say more about what it means for it to be either pragmatic or absolute. You don't have to say what William James thought because both have reading to do for that, and you don't
Mhm.
necessarily have to say what you think, but maybe you can explain for our listeners what it means to believe pragmatically that there is free will opposed to absolutely.
Ah, well, I mean, I guess I do ultimately believe in free will in a more or less absolute sense. Um, because of the whole gestalt that has distilled itself within me over these years. Um, and the idea I referred to it before as the Zen masters saying, "What was your face before your mother and father were born?" And or just the general Buddhist idea that there was a lifetime before this, and that this reincarnation, recycling, that we come back to life, and that there might be some progress through that, even if you, of course, there's not a scientific way to prove such a thing, although the Tibetans have some very interesting anecdotal evidence of such. um, I think that it speaks to an intuition that we are who we are in some part distinct from our circumstance, from where our foot is nailed down, from the circumstances of our birth, from our language and culture, and that there is still
Kind of
something
like the
unique.
claim the claim of the soul, essentially.
Yeah, maybe the soul has a lot of extra baggage, and I'm looking more at the phenomenological intuition that there is more to you than just the result of billiard balls, and that you came with a certain content, and that is the thing that determines what you pick out of the maelstrom, the cognitive maelstrom, the directions that you look in life to find meaning or to make meaning, or to gather more data about the whole thing. And that's where that whole idea of karma comes in, right? That there's these seeds that we water inadvertently to feed us back a certain experience of reality that, for better or worse, broadens our model of what is and how it works.
That was a
So,
great description of karma. We should snip that and use it in a short.
uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, because I think that I do believe there is a great that this is all educational ultimately, or as I've said before, that the purpose of life is the evolution of consciousness, and that applies both collectively and individually. And so that whole game board doesn't make sense without free will in there. I think that's part of the great mystery of existence is this, you know, as we've referred to with, Ibn al-Arabi, God hiding himself with himself. And I don't know that that's that gendered in the original, but yeah, this idea, there's just these two sides, two things, and that mystery that exists outside of us also exists inside of us, and that has to do with this unique. Heidegger calls it, being in the world. And what does it mean for there to be a world? And where does that world reside? And what does it mean to be in a thing? And uh, for example, this idea that consciousness lives inside this container, and then it's like consciousness travels out and gets data and brings it back in and does this calculation within. He says, no, 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 no. Our being is always out there. It's always out there. Well, that's a fundamentally different way to experience your connectedness to things if you really get the insight that is trying to point to. So that's just a finger pointing to the moon. And what's worse, it's in German originally, right? Which is not my long suit. German's not my long suit for sure.
It's a fun idea. Your consciousness is always out there. I guess the implication is not just out there, but out there and in here, because in here's, just as relevant as space. But um, it makes me think that we think of consciousness basically the way we think about how our eye works, right? The light
Right.
bounces off an object and strikes our eye, and then some stuff happens and the brain flips the image upside down and adds purple, and then there you have sight. So it is
Yep.
very much coming from outside, right? The light and the objects are outside and you're a processor. So I think we default to thinking about consciousness that way, and I've never fully tried it on to think of it another way, even though I've had experiences of kind of unity, you know?
Well, I think this plugs into Husserl's idea of intentionality, the way that at the very earliest dawn of our consciousness, we reach out into the world. We we um, it's Bergson's élan vital. It's the impulse for the flower to bloom. And that our consciousness naturally moves out into the world that way. And I guess the argument would be that once it's done that, it never fully retracts.
Hmm.
It does maybe go somewhere else in dreams, which is this whole other thing. But even in dreams, we don't dream of another world. We dream of altered variations of this world. The pieces all come from this world of experience, typically, right? Not that weird things don't happen. There may be two Mickey Rooneys and a large goose. I can't account for any of that. But there is this idea that we're and maybe this is a deeper or more unconscious way, semi-conscious way of asking and answering questions.
Hmm.
Again, in a holodeck, borrowing from Star Trek kind of a way. It's like, well, that's what I should have said, or you know, and because I've had these recent experiences of more luminous dreaming, actually being aware and going, okay, I'm in a dream. Now, what can I do now that I'm in a dream? It's definitely opened up a whole bunch of like, what about that sort of thing? And that, and again, you come to Chuang Tzu, right? And the butterfly. I dreamt I was a butterfly. And when I was dreaming, I saw things like a butterfly, and now I woke up and I'm wondering, am I a butterfly dreaming that I'm Chuang Chou, or am I, was I just dreaming I was a butterfly? Who knows? And that it does have to do with this mystery of consciousness in a setting. And, if we are meaning, then we are also contextualized. And
That's actually a good
that's that.
example of where it's easy for me to be a pragmatist, and kind of take the, you know, I'm going to use the word idealist differently now because, idealism, the way Michael Wolff was using it to mean this is all a dream or a simulation or, whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, and uh, to me, that's about as unpragmatic as it gets. So I'm fine acting as if that's not the case.
It's
And
dialed up all the way at the other end of that spectrum, and pragmatism is way down at the other end.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Although,
interesting.
and that's why I'm curious, and I want to unfold James when we get there, is to because he did have this idea of varieties of religious experience, and it seems like he was so into. He actually did experiments with laughing gas to try to understand different. Like this guy would have been a Porgero for sure if that avenue was open to him, right? And because he was really interested in the different tunings that consciousness can take, and which I think that if you've looked at it pathologically, you're going to ask that same question. But then to look at it in the varieties of religious experiences, even more kind of in the other end, other direction. And um, so yeah, it necessarily raises certain questions about, what is real, and just in general the mystery of consciousness and life, the universe, and everything. Here we are again.
There we have it. Um, well, that was interesting. I kind of going through what living systems are, and how we apprehend complexity, and how our cognitive models work, how we're using this forum to drive the expansion of our own cognitive models, and kind of some of the mechanisms of how we do that. So yeah, I
And to
think
model that dialogue, that dialectic process, I guess.
yeah. So yeah, that was an interesting episode, and I think there again, as maybe as always, there are some threads there that we even promised to come back to. So um,
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
we
I don't
certainly
I
will.
don't see a way to avoid it, honestly.
Yeah,
The William James piece is so big. It's so big. I think I mentioned earlier that Bertrand Russell said Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, who invented calculus, one of the with Newton, and William James. It's like I knew he was in there, but I didn't think that he was that in the
yeah,
middle of everything.
right.
And I think that when Bertrand Russell said that, he was quoting Alfred North Whitehead. So those are pretty nice. Pretty good guys to be quoting on your book jacket or whatever you want to think about. Um,
Yeah, cool.
cool.
Thanks, Brian.
See you next time.